tell me what's happening!
Well, you're having a nervous breakdown. That's what's happening.
You're part of this, aren't you?
Roman!
Meryl!
You are scaring me!
No, you're scaring me, Meryl. What are you gonna do? Dice me? Slice me or peel me? There's so many choices!
No! Do something!
What'd you say?
The goal of all narrative storytelling is, to some extent, welcome us into an identification with a character. This identification can serve many a purpose, but if we are unable to identify with anyone within a diegesis, we have been failed by whichever text we are engaging with. The means through which we are invited to identify vary, but an especially powerful tool, one that is unique to visual media like film and video games, is perspective. Still, only video games have wholeheartedly embraced the power of perspective, utilizing a subjective shot, the first-person point of view, regularly across several different texts. So why is it that cinema has struggled to effectively make use of subjectivity as a means of identification? Is it even appropriate to claim that video games are more successful in doing so? Media scholar Alexander Galloway would have us believe that is the case. He identifies the use of subjectivity in video games as achieving an intuitive sense of effective motion. He goes on to suggest a close relationship between the first-person point of view and the representation of action so commonly associated with video games. Galloway seems confident that video games succeed in their subjectivity because of our own control over the motion of our avatar. To Galloway, I present Her Story, a game that succeeds in identification, but perhaps not how Galloway and his peers might expect. Her Story is, for all intents and purposes, a first-person video game. We are staring at a computer screen, completely fused with our anonymous avatar. In a way, the first-person perspective extends to our own real-world surroundings, as the game's diegesis is limited to the computer screen itself. You cannot pull away or zoom in. Your only perspective of the game is that which you decide for yourself with your own body. Therefore, there is no motion in Her Story, nor is there much action to speak of, and yet the game succeeds in its subjectivity, so much so that we are willing to identify as somebody, even if we don't know who that somebody is. Perhaps that somebody is ourselves or some imagined fantasy, but the total fusion of player and avatar is what allows for the game's narratively satisfying twist ending. Contrast this with the 1946 film Lady in the Lake, a failed formal experiment in which the story is told almost exclusively through a first-person perspective. The experiment fails for a number of reasons, but particularly due to a bizarre opening sequence that immediately separates viewer and protagonist.
My name is Marlowe, Philip Marlowe. Occupation, private detective. You know, somebody says, follow that guy. So I follow him. Somebody says, find that female. So I find her. But some cases, like this one, kind of creep up on you on their hands and knees. And the first thing you know, you're in it up to your neck.
As well as several moments throughout the film that show our protagonist in the mirror.
Vain female, aren't you?
In these moments, the illusion is broken. We are not in control. I don't see myself staring back at me.
You'll meet the people, you'll find the clues, and maybe you'll solve it quick, and maybe you won't. You think you will, eh? Okay? You're smart. But let me give you a tip. You've got to watch them. You've got to watch them all the time. Because things happen when you least expect them.
But the success of Her Story suggests that cinema can utilize perspective and subjectivity as a means of identification. It does not have to be called upon solely to alienate or disorient, as Galloway suggests. Film scholar Vivian Sobchak identifies a certain tendency of film that perhaps explains what makes the use of subjectivity so tricky. Film looks at and visually produces its objects and is intentionally drawn towards them as things to be seen, the whole of its invisible bodily machinery doing what must be done to reach them perceptively, to express and bring them into visibility. Perhaps cinema must resist this temptation if it is to utilize subjectivity. Her Story facilitates identification by allowing very little into our view. The fusion of avatar and player allows for a constant engagement with our own identity, notably different from most films and video games that ask us to identify with an other. It's no secret that we all hope to feed our egos in our media consumption. Of course we want to see ourselves, and Her Story allows us to do so for much of our playthrough. An updated take on Lady in the Lake might do the same, rendering protagonist and viewer one and the same, and avoiding bringing into view anything that might create separation. Now that's a movie I would play.